The men gathered around the nail keg in Amos Pruitt's store had found a phrase they liked, and they passed it from mouth to mouth, the way they passed a plug of tobacco, each one shaving it a little finer before handing it along. A palace for chickens, they agreed, nodding into their coffee, and a coffin for herself. They said it with the easy cruelty of men who have never had to bet their lives on a single idea. 12 miles north of that stove, out where the road thinned to two wagon ruts and dead grass, a woman stood nailing mismatched window sashes to cottonwood posts driven 3 feet out from her cabin wall in a line that made no earthly sense to anyone who happened past. The glass she worked with was wavy and faintly green, the kind that bent the light into ribbons. Some panes still carried painted station lettering, reversed now ghost words running backward across the prairie afternoon. The whole assembly rattled in the wind like a crate of empty bottles dragged over stone. Edith Halverson scraped old putty from a sash with the flat of a knife, warmed it in a tin cup balanced on a flat rock, and pressed it back into the joint without lifting her eyes to the road. She had not chosen this quarter section. She had inherited it the way a person inherits a debt without consent and without escape. Walter Halverson had filed on the claim in the spring of 1886, back when the grass still wore the green of promise, and the railroad agent in Redfield swore the little flag stop at Garrett would swell into a proper town inside 2 years. Walter had a particular gift, which was the gift of hearing only the syllables that flattered what he already wanted to believe. The agent told him opportunity. Walter heard certainty. He signed his name to the filing paper and drove the wagon north without ever asking Edith whether the soil looked right or the creek ran the whole year through. It did neither. The creek failed by August. The dirt was heavy gumbo clay that broke plowshares and swallowed fence posts whole, closing over them like water. Still, he built because building was the only answer Walter ever had to a question. He raised a cabin of green cottonwood logs 16 feet by 20, with a plank door he was proud of, and a chinking job of clay and hay he had no business being proud of at all. He planted 12 acres of wheat into ground that resented every seed. He carried supplies on credit from Pruitt's counterflour and coffee, and nails and lamp oil and stove blacking, and he set his signature against $29 to be paid out of a harvest that existed only in his imagination. Hail in July flattened 8 acres in the space of 9 minutes. A hot wind in August curled what remained into brittle stalks, not worth the twine to bind them. By the close of September in 1887, Walter Halverson owed $29 he could not raise, held title to a cabin that wept cold air from every seam, and shared his bed with a wife who had stopped asking him questions because his answers had long since stopped meaning anything at all. She had watched the man shrink inside his own certainty until there was nothing left to argue with. So she fed the hens and counted the oats and said little, and waited for some shift in the weather of him that never came. He left on a Tuesday, and he left in the manner of a man who had already decided that none of it had been his fault. He took the team the one rifle and $38 Edith had stitched into a flour sack and tucked behind the stove money she had earned 1 egg at a time, selling to the Garrett freight crew through a whole sweating summer. He left no word on the table. He gave no hint of his road or his intention. Edith woke to a barn standing open and empty, a stove shelf swept bare of the coffee tin, and the thin, wet sound of Samuel coughing somewhere up in the loft. The boy was 7. He was not her son. He was her dead sister's child, shipped west the previous June, after scarlet fever carried off his mother and his father proved unequal to the double weight of grief and a small boy at the same time. Samuel had arrived with a cracked slate, a wool coat 2 full sizes beyond him, and a habit of pressing his thin shoulders to the nearest wall whenever a voice climbed above the level of ordinary talk. He did not ask where Walter had gone. He studied Edith's face the way a dog studies a hand that has sometimes fed it and sometimes struck it, reading for the next thing. And he did without protest whatever she told him to do. She told him to feed the hens, and he went. There were 23 of them, a parliament of mixed breeds, some Dominique with their barred gray feathers, some Plymouth Rock, a handful of red birds whose parentage no one could vouch for. They laid enough to trade for salt and oats at the Garrett stop, and they were the only livestock Walter had not thought worth stealing. The 2 milk goats stood tied behind the cabin still, because Walter had never managed to rope them into a wagon by himself and had evidently judged them more trouble than they were worth. So they remained chewing at the frost-killed weeds, oblivious heirs to a vanished man's neglect. Edith stood in the barn doorway that gray Tuesday morning and made her accounting the way her father had taught her to make any accounting slowly and without flinching from the total. 23 hens, 2 goats, 6 bushels of oats, 2 sacks of cracked corn, 1 cord and 3/4 of cottonwood split, but green and weeping sap, $11.60 in a tobacco tin beneath a loose floorboard. Money Walter had never found because Edith had learned early in the marriage never to keep everything in one place. No horse, no rifle, no husband. 12 miles from Redfield and 4 from the half-dead flag stop at Garrett, with winter already laying its first hard edge along the northern rim of the sky. The deputy rode out 3 weeks later on a Thursday afternoon, thick with the smell of coal smoke off his coat and the labored breath of a horse pushed too long against the wind. Roy Martin was not an unkind man, and that was precisely the trouble with him, because unkindness she could have braced against. He sat at her table, laid a folded sheet of blue legal paper flat between the 2 coffee cups, and explained in the careful voice of a man delivering news he wished were someone else's to deliver. Walter's disappearance had been ruled abandonment by the county clerk. Under the practice of the day, a deserted wife might file the claim in her own name and prove it up herself. Edith knew the law already. Every woman scratching at the Dakota soil knew it the way she knew the signs of weather. But the law carried a hook inside it, and the hook was this: she could keep the claim only if she stayed on the claim. Residence and improvement 5 years all told. Quit the quarter section before the proving up was done, and the filing would be counted as relinquished free for any man to buy for the cost of the fee alone. And Amos Pruitt, who already held Walter's $29 like a man holding the short end of a tethered animal, had been making quiet inquiries. Martin could not bring his eyes up to meet hers when he came to the heart of it. The blue paper lifted in a draft and snapped against her wrist. The words came out of him sideways. "You leave, they call it desertion of the claim." Samuel stood at the stove with the cracked slate pressed to his chest like a breastplate. Hannah Brune, who had driven up from her dugout 3 miles south to return a borrowed crock, sat in her wagon out in the yard and watched the whole exchange through the open door, saying nothing, missing nothing. Edith folded her hands on the table to keep them from doing anything she would regret. "I am not leaving." Martin's gaze traveled the cabin while he answered, taking in the gray daylight that leaked through the chinking gaps, the firewood stacked too thin against the east wall, the boy who would not look away from his boots. He knew the wood was not enough. They both knew it, and the knowing sat between them heavier than the law. "I am not telling you to go, ma'am. I am telling you what comes after if you do." Then he stood, set his hat to his head, and walked back out into a wind that took his words and scattered them across the dead grass. Hannah climbed down from the wagon and came inside without waiting to be asked which was her way. She poured herself the last of the coffee, stood with the cup in both hands, and said nothing for a long, full minute while the stove ticked and the boy breathed. When she finally spoke, it was not comfort she offered, because Hannah Brune had buried a husband on this prairie and had no comfort left to spend on optimism. "How much wood have you got?" Edith told her. 1 cord and 3/4. The widow looked at the stack through the doorway and exhaled slowly through her nose, and that exhalation said everything that needed saying about a cord and 3/4 in October. Gideon Brackey arrived 2 days behind the deputy, and where Martin had brought reluctance, Brackey brought arithmetic. He was 61, a former Army teamster who had hauled supply through Minnesota winters that killed lesser men, and he now served as road overseer for the district. He was not her friend, and he was not her enemy. He was a man who had come to believe across 4 decades of frozen mornings that the prairie kept rules, that people who ignored those rules died, and that sentiment about the matter was a luxury reserved for those who could afford to lose. He walked the whole property in 12 minutes flat. He laid his bare palm against the west wall near the bedstead and held it there as if taking a pulse. He paced off the firewood pile in 6 long strides and made a sound low in his throat that promised nothing good. He crouched beside the stove and set his hand near the door where a thin crescent of ash had collected on the floor, blown there by wind that came not through any window, but through the body of the wall itself. "The frost is already inside the logs." Edith offered no reply because there was no honest reply to give. Brackey straightened to his full bent height, and in standing he blotted out the light from the single south window so that for a moment the cabin went dim. "A prairie winter wants 6 cords at the minimum, 8 if the wind holds out of the north. You have got something under 2, and it is green cottonwood that will burn fast and wet, and give you back more smoke than heat. When the real cold comes, you will feed it a full armload every 4 hours. That buys you 3 weeks. The season runs 4 months. She lifted her chin. I will burn it slower. His answer landed flat as a struck nail, and it was the first of several things he said that day that she would carry the rest of her life. The stove does not care what you intend. He told her then what a reasonable man would tell her. Move into town. Hire out her hands at washing and mending. Let Hannah take the hens. Sell the goats while they still had flesh on them. The boy could board with the Presbyterian widow on 2nd Street who kept orphans at 50 cents the week. The claim would be lost, certainly, but Edith Halverson would be alive to see April, which was more than the firewood promised. And my nephew. She said it quietly, but the quiet had iron in it. The boy goes to strangers, to people who own firewood. She turned and looked at Samuel where he stood, one small hand flattened against the logs, as though he alone were holding the cabin upright, his eyes fixed still on the old man's boots. Mr. Brack, how many supply wagons did you drive through those Minnesota winters? More than he could count, he allowed. And how many of them carried somebody else's child asleep in the back? He did not answer that. He put on his hat. At the threshold he paused and turned, and there was no malice in him, only the weary honesty of a man who had dug too many graves. I have buried people more stubborn than you, Mrs. Halverson. Every last one of them believed they were smarter than the weather. Then he was gone, and the cabin felt smaller for his leaving, not because of the room his body had taken, but because of the room his verdict left behind. 6 cords minimum. She had under 2. An armload every 4 hours. 3 weeks of heat to span 4 months of cold. Edith sat down on the edge of the bedstead and let the figures press against her chest like a hand. She could not buy the wood. $11.60 would not cover half a cord at Redfield's winter prices. She could not cut it herself. The nearest timber stood 6 miles east along a bottom, and even that was soft, wet cottonwood. And she had no horse, no wagon, no means to drag a single log across the open ground. She could not borrow it, for no neighbor held a surplus, and charity out here was measured in cupfuls, never in cords. And she could not leave because leaving handed the claim, and with it the only roof she could call her own, straight into Pruitt's waiting ledger. So she sat while the light shifted across the packed earth floor, and Samuel fed the birds, and the wind pushed small gray drifts of ash from the stove door in a slow, steady tide. She sat and turned the problem over until its edges were smooth, asking herself the same question from every side. How does a person pull enough heat out of a Dakota winter to keep 2 bodies alive at 20 below without burning what she did not have to burn? And then her gaze fell on the broken east window. A hailstone had punched through the corner pane back in September. Walter had nailed a board across the gap, and the wall had gone dark there ever since. But the board had warped as it dried, and now a single stripe of late sun slid through the gap and lay across the floor near the stove. The floor was packed dirt black with years of soot and spilled coffee. Where the sun touched it, the dirt was warm. Not warm enough to matter, not warm enough to save anyone, but warm, where the rest of the room was cold, and the difference snagged something loose in her memory. Edith had grown up in Wisconsin along the river bluffs near La Crosse, and her father, Anders Lund, had spent 15 years tending and repairing the long glass houses of a commercial nursery set into those bluffs above the water. She had not thought about her father's work in years. She had not needed to. But now, perched on a bedstead in a cabin that could not keep her alive, she remembered a thing he had shown her when she was 9 years old. He had brought her into one of the glass houses on a January afternoon, with snow banked high against the panes outside. The air was cold enough that her breath took shape and hung there, but inside the long room a warmth pressed at her like an open palm. Nothing was burning. The coal stove at the far end stood dead and cold. The warmth was only the low winter sun coming through the glass to strike the stone floor, and the stone giving the heat back up into the room. Her father had taken her small hand and laid her palm flat against the inside of the glass wall, and it had been warm to the touch, while a blizzard worked the far side. He had set a cracked pane over a flat black stone and told her to wait, and within 2 minutes she felt the heat climbing off that stone, caught and held between the glass above and the ground below. His words had stayed with her across 30 years without her once needing them. Winter's sun is not warmth, not until it is trapped. Edith stood and crossed the room and pried the warped board off the east window, and the full stripe of sun spilled in and laid itself across her hands. The idea did not arrive whole and shining. It arrived as a question, the kind that sounds like foolishness when a person says it out loud and turns to brilliance only after it has been answered. If glass could trap the sun's heat inside her father's nursery, then could glass trap heat around a cabin? Not set into the wall as a window, but standing off from the wall as a second skin, a separate wall with a pocket of still air held captive between the two. Air the sun would warm and the glass would hold, and the wind could never reach to steal. She understood the principle in her bones taught to her without instruction in the way children absorb their father's trades through proximity and repetition. Glass let the sunlight pass through, but would not let the warmed air climb back out. Dark surfaces drank the heat. Pale surfaces threw it away. Still air held its warmth, while moving air gave it up. The true enemy out here had never been the cold itself, but the wind that stripped heat off a wall, the way a swollen river strips soil from a cut bank grain by grain until the whole thing slumps into the current. The cabin's failure was not that it lacked a stove. The stove worked well enough. The failure was that the wind carried off every measure of heat the stove produced before that heat could settle into the room. The green logs had shrunk as they cured and opened gaps in the chinking. The west wall faced the prevailing wind and leaked so badly that ash drifted sideways from the stove door. Burning more wood would help, the way bailing helps a boat with a hole punched in its hull. A person could bail until her arms gave out, or she could find the hole and stop it. And what if the hole was not within the wall at all but outside it? What if the wind never touched the logs in the first place? She turned that over for 3 days. She scratched diagrams into the dirt floor with the point of a nail and erased them with her heel, and scratched them again by lamplight. She held her hand in the stripe of sun from the broken window and felt the warmth gather on the black earth beneath it. She stepped outside at noon and stood with her spine against the south wall and felt the sun lying full on her face while the wind cut at the back of her neck, and she understood that both were constant out here, sun and wind alike, and that the only real question was which of the two she could capture and which she could turn aside. On the fourth morning, she walked to Garrett. The flagstop sat 4 miles east along the rails, a cluster of 3 weathered buildings beside the track, a waiting room, a freight shed, and a section house for the maintenance crews. A spring storm had wrung the waiting room's roof half off its rafters back in May, and the railroad had chosen to abandon the structure rather than spend the money to set it right, shifting what little traffic remained over to Redfield. The agent, Orrin Voss, was a patient man who stayed on because his wife liked the quiet, and because the company still paid him a small wage to flag the eastbound freight twice a week. Edith found him sweeping the platform of a building scarcely anyone used anymore, the broom moving out of habit more than purpose. She asked about the waiting room, and he told her the company had written it off entire. But the glass still sat in its sashes, he said 48 panes, mostly 10 inches by 14, seated in 12 wooden frames. Some were cracked through, some bubbled with age, and 2 still wore their painted station lettering. But glass was glass, and a sash was a sash, and Edith needed both more than she needed almost anything. $3 and 2 dozen eggs, Voss offered, and if she could haul it herself, he would let it go. He looked at her, then a thin woman in a mended coat with no horse and no wagon standing on a dead platform in the October wind, and he did not laugh. He had watched enough homesteaders come and go to know that the ones who lived through it were not always the ones who looked the part. He would write her a receipt for the glass, he said. The receipt would matter a great deal later on, though neither of them could have known it standing there in the cold. She hauled the sashes home on a hand sled she built from cottonwood scraps and a length of harness leather, 2 frames to a trip. 6 trips across 4 days, 4 miles out and 4 miles back each time, until she had walked 32 miles to carry windows that any sensible person would have left to rot. Her boots split at the sole on the 3rd trip, and she bound them with strips of burlap and a twist of wire. Her shoulders ached in a way that settled past the muscle and took up residence in the bone. Samuel pulled the smaller frames, the ones holding only 2 panes, and he never once complained, because complaining was a privilege he did not yet understand he was permitted. By the middle of October, she had all 12 frames stacked along the south face of the cabin, sheltered under a canvas tarp she had borrowed from Hannah at the price of 1 setting hen. The glass caught the slanting afternoon light and threw broken rainbows across the sod. From the road, it looked as though Edith Halverson had begun collecting windows the way some lonely souls collect cats, without plan, without reason, without the smallest prospect of a useful end. Hannah was the first to put the question to her face. The widow stood beside the stacked sash with her arms folded, 3 sons waiting in the wagon, her own dugout 3 miles off smelling of damp earth and boiled turnips, and asked her plainly what in God's name she thought she was doing. Edith laid it out. A lean-to running the south wall and turning the corner along the east, standing 3 feet off the cabin logs, 7 feet high at the eave, and 4.5 at the outer rail, the glass angled to catch the low winter sun, a packed dirt floor under straw-hinged vents along the top. The cabin would sit inside a held pocket of air that the sun would heat and the glass would keep and the wind would never find. Hannah listened without her face changing, which was worse than any argument she could have made. When she answered with the practicality of a woman who had stopped trusting any idea she could not eat or burn. Glass breaks. Edith knew it. Chickens stink. She would keep the bedding dry. Wind goes through everything. Not through glass, Edith told her. It goes through it in pieces, Edith. That is the whole point. The widow let the silence sit. Then she gathered her reins. I paid for half your nails last week. Do not make me sorry, I felt the pity, and she drove south without once looking back. Edith did not chase her with more reasons because Hannah's reasons were every one of them sound. The glass might shatter in a gust. The hens might foul the trapped air until the logs rotted soft. The vents might not bleed off moisture fast enough to save the wood. Each objection was a true road to ruin. But every figure Gideon Brackey had laid down was equally true, and those figures led to a frozen body come February. The choice was never between safety and risk. The choice was between a certain failure and an uncertain chance, and a woman with $11 and a 7-year-old in the loft did not have the standing to turn down a chance because it frightened her. Amos Pruitt heard about the glass before she had set a single pane. He was 48 square-built master of the store in Redfield that served as bank and post office, and the social court where every reputation within 15 miles was tried and sentenced. He made money when the homesteaders prospered, for then they bought his goods. He made better money when they failed, for then he bought their relinquishments at a song, took their livestock at distressed prices, and folded their debts into land he could resell when the next wave of settlers came riding in behind the rails. Edith's ruin was worth more to his ledger than her survival could ever be. Her quarter section was good ground despite the gumbo, and Walter's $29 had already laid a lien across the heart of it. He did not ride out to the claim. He had no need to. He simply talked, and on the prairie talk outran weather. She is building a palace for chickens, he told the men at the stove, and a coffin for herself. The phrase was a small masterpiece, short enough to repeat and cruel enough to remember, and just plausible enough that every man who passed it on felt a touch wiser for having agreed. Inside a week, half the homesteaders between Redfield and Garrett had it on their tongues. Children threw snowballs at the stacked sash when they passed the road. A freight driver refused to carry the frames the last leg unless she paid $2 cash in advance, money she did not have to spend. The reckoning at the counter came in the last week of October. Edith walked the 12 miles to Redfield to buy 8 pounds of cut nails, which she needed for the bracing, and the sill plates, because without nails, the sashes had nothing to hold them to the supports. And without supports, the glass was only expensive kindling, waiting on a strong wind. Pruitt stood behind his counter with the nail keg set between them, and he did not refuse the sale outright because that was never how the man worked. He made the buying feel like a sentence handed down from the bench. Glass is for town windows, Mrs. Halverson, not for prairie wind. She asked for 8 pounds on credit to be paid in eggs by spring. Frozen hens do not lay. 3 men sat by the stove. Not one of them looked at her. Not one looked away. The silence had a weight to it like a held breath waiting to be spent. He weighed out 4 pounds. This is what your credit is worth. Come spring, if you are still standing on that claim, we can talk about the rest. She left with half the nails she had come for, and outside in the cold. Hannah Brunn was loading flour into her wagon, having heard every word of it through the open door. Without a single word of her own, the widow walked back inside, bought 4 pounds of cut nails, and carried them out to Edith in the middle of the street. This is a loan, not a gift. Edith understood. And if your glass house falls down around your ears, you still owe me for the nails. Edith understood that too. The paper sack weighed 4 pounds, and 4 pounds of nails was enough to begin. Not enough to finish, but enough to begin, and beginning was the only door open to her. She started building on the 16th of October with no plan drawn on paper because she had no paper to draw it on. The design lived in the dirt floor of the cabin, scratched out each night with a nail, and revised each morning against the lessons the previous day had cost her. The south wall, first 20 feet of glass, running its length, the 12 frames each braced at 4 points to cottonwood posts, sunk 2 feet into the ground and cross-tied with scrap lumber. The sill would rest on flat creek stones Samuel carried up from the dry bed, 3 inches clear of the dirt, to keep the wood from wicking the ground's moisture and rotting where she could not see it. The first post went into the iron-hard ground crooked, and she hauled it out and reset it. The second went in straight only after she soaked the hole overnight with water hauled from the well, because the clay had set like fired brick, and no shovel on earth would bite it dry. By dusk on that first day, she had 2 posts standing and nothing more, and the knuckles of both hands had split where the shovel handle wore through her gloves and laid the skin open in thin red seams. Samuel held the posts steady while she packed the earth around them. He weighed less than the timber he braced, but he leaned into it with the whole of his small body, and the post did not shift, and that small, fierce holding was its own kind of answer to the men at the stove. The frost came down hard on the 22nd of October, killing the last of the standing grass and turning the topsoil to a single sheet of iron. After that, the post holes went from difficult to nearly past doing. She heated water on the stove and poured it steaming into each hole to soften the ground, and even so, a single hole ate an hour, and she counted 14 more posts standing between her and a finished frame. She was 3 posts into the south run, her breath smoking, and her ruined hands wrapped in rag when she straightened to ease her back, and saw a man standing motionless at the fence line watching her work. He was tall and stooped at the shoulders, dressed in a canvas coat patched at both elbows, and a hat that had clearly met more rain than brush in its long life. He carried a carpenter's brace square in one hand, and nothing whatsoever in the other. He watched her try to lift a sash frame up onto the sill alone, a task that wanted 3 hands and a level surface, and a person who knew the trade, none of which she possessed. The frame slipped from her grip. The bottom rail caught the edge of the sill, and one pane cracked across with a sound like a green branch breaking underfoot. Edith set the frame down and looked at the ruined glass, and did not weep because weeping spent an energy she had budgeted for other things entirely. The man came across the dead grass without hurry. He offered no name. He crouched beside the fallen frame and ran a single finger along the line of the crack, then lifted his eyes to the sill, to the posts, to the angle at which the glass stood off from the cabin wall, reading the whole rough work the way another man might read a page. His first words to her were not a greeting, but a question, and the question told her more about him than any introduction could have. Why 3 feet out? She met his look. Why not flush against the logs? The answer was already waiting in her worn smooth by 3 days of turning it over. Because still air is warmer than nailed glass. Something moved behind the man's face, then a flicker she could not yet name, and he picked up the cracked pane and turned it to the light, and she understood without being told that whatever had brought him 4 miles into a cold wind, it was not pity. It was that single sentence, and the fact that a desperate fool would never have known to say it. His name was Soren Dahl, and Edith learned it only after he had stayed long enough to earn the asking. He was 56 years old, born in Norway, and trained to the carpenter's trade in Minnesota, and for 11 years he had worked the rails raising bridges and snow sheds and depot porches across the northern country, mending storm vestibules that lesser hands had botched. He had come into the county to winter with a cousin who had since pulled up stakes for Oregon, leaving him in a rented room above the Redfield livery with a cough he could not shake loose, and no particular reason left to stay. He had heard the talk about the glass like everyone else, but where Pruitt heard foolishness and Brackey heard a stubbornness fit for burying Soren Dahl, had heard something that put a 4-mile walk into his old legs against a wind that bit through canvas. He did not offer to help, not that first afternoon. He turned the cracked pane in his hands, set it aside on the sill, then looked at the frame she had failed to mount, and told her the trouble plainly. Your sill is too narrow. The frame wants a lip to rest on, or the first gust pushes it clean off. She told him she had no lumber to spare for a wider sill, You have got enough if you split it the right way. He took up the next cottonwood piece she had cut and drove the wedge along the grain instead of across it, and the wood opened into a thinner, broader board, the way a book falls open to a marked page. He laid the new board atop the old sill to build a 2-inch lip, then stood the sash frame against it. The frame sat. It did not rock. That is the first lesson. The wood tells you where it wants to break. You listen or you fight it, and fighting it spends nails you do not have. He stayed until the light failed, saying nothing of whether he would return. But the next morning, before she had finished milking the goats, she found him already seated on the sill plate with a tin cup of cold coffee in his fist, waiting on her the way a man waits on work he has decided belongs to him. There was no agreement between them, no wage discussed, no thanks exchanged that might have made the thing fragile. Some arrangements survive precisely because nobody puts words around them, and this was one. He came at first light. He worked until he could no longer see the putty line. He walked the 4 miles back to his rented room in the dark, then walked them again before dawn. The first true skill he taught her was the triangle. He set 2 scrap boards into a rectangle and leaned his weight against one corner, and the whole shape twisted and folded flat as a dropped hand of cards. Then he ran a diagonal brace from corner to corner, nailed it fast, and told Samuel to push. The boy threw both small hands against it. The frame did not give. Every sash gets this, every single one. Glass does not break from the cold. It breaks from flex. The frame moves, the putty cracks, the pane walks out of its groove and falls. A triangle will not move. A rectangle always will give in time. He showed her how to cut the brace at 45 degrees with a handsaw drawn slow, how to toenail it home with 2 nails rather than 3, because 3 driven into green cottonwood would split the grain and ruin the joint. He made her test each frame by shoving it sideways with her hip before it ever touched a sill. The second skill was the putty and the bedding of the glass. The old linseed putty pulled from the garret sashes had gone hard and crazed with age. He warmed it in a tin near the stove until it softened, worked it between his thumbs into a rope, then pressed it into the rabbet around each pane in one unbroken bead, sealing wood to glass without trapping a single bubble beneath. He did not smear it the way an impatient hand would. Cold putty cracks, warm putty seals. You do this in the morning after the stove has run a while, not in the afternoon when your fingers have gone to wood. The third skill was the matter of expansion, which she would not have guessed at on her own. Glass swelled and shrank with the temperature. So did the wood that held it, but never at the same pace. Pinch a pane too tight against its glazing points, he warned, and the first hard swing of weather would crack it straight across. He showed her to leave a whisper of space barely the width of a thought, just enough that the pane could breathe without rattling. You hear a rattle, you fix it that day. A rattle means the point is walked. A point that walks lets the pane walk. A pane that walks falls. By the close of their first week of labor together, she had grasped a thing about Soren Dahl she had not expected to find. He was not bending his back over her ruined frames out of charity, nor because she was a woman left alone, nor because the silent boy stirred his sympathy. He was here because she had answered his question correctly. A person who said that still air held more warmth than nailed glass was not a desperate fool flailing at the weather. She was a person who understood the principle running beneath the work, and Soren had spent 3 decades raising structures that had to outlast wind and ice and the indifference of employers who cared nothing for beauty so long as the thing stood. He knew competence the way a carpenter knows straight grain, not by testing it, not by asking after it, but by the feel of it under his hand. The weather granted no extension for the learning. On the 28th of October, with 12 feet of the south glass standing and the last 8 feet of sill still unset, 4 panes cracked in the night when a gust flexed 2 frames she had mounted before he had taught her the diagonal. She spent a whole day tearing them down to brace them properly while the mercury slid to 19 degrees and the sky went the color of old lead. The frost crept earlier each dusk, and the daylight she had to work in pulled in tighter from both ends, the shadows stretching long across the iron ground by mid-afternoon, while the glass shell stood nowhere near half-finished. He came every morning all the same, walking the 4 miles in full dark, arriving before she had the goats milked, working until the light gave out under his hands. He never explained the why of it. She never pressed him for the answer. The work itself ground on against her small ruin by small ruin. Two panes cracked 1 week from flex frames she had braced before the diagonal lesson, which she had to pull down and build again from nothing. Two more went when Samuel, chasing a hen that had got loose, kicked a stone that struck the bottom rail of a mounted frame, a mishap so small in the doing and so large in the cost, that Edith stood looking at the shattered glass a full minute before she knelt to pick the pieces from the frozen mud, her face giving nothing away to the boy who had begun silently to cry. 48 panes to start, 8 gone already, 40 remaining, and the design had use for every last one of them. Soren said nothing about the broken glass because what was broken stayed broken regardless of what a man said over it. What he said instead was a thing she would carry into every winter after: glass where it matters, cloth where it does not. He was teaching her triage, the hard arithmetic of a structure that could not be made perfect on the means at hand. The south wall mattered most, for it faced the low winter sun and drank the most of it. The east wall caught the morning light, but less of it, while the east corner took the cruelest of the wind. So glass would go on the south glass and oilcloth on the east, and a board over any gap that could not hold a pane. Not everything could be saved. The trick was knowing what to spend the glass on. By the 6th of November, the east corner stood framed 4 posts, sunk the corner brace set at its angle. 6 sashes hung along the east wall. But the deepening cold had begun to fight the work in earnest. The putty he warmed inside the cabin stiffened before he could carry it the 10 feet to the glass. His fingers cramped into hooks. The splits across her knuckles opened wider, the blood freezing in thin dark lines on the wood before she could wipe it clear. The 11th of November came warm, and the warmth was a thief dressed as a mercy. The mercury climbed to 42, which ought to have been welcome, and was instead a small disaster. The clay chinking on the west wall, softened by the thaw, slumped in its seams and opened a gap behind the stove. Cold air poured through it, the stove draft reversed on itself. The cabin filled with smoke until Samuel coughed till his eyes ran red. Edith patched the seam with fresh clay straw strips torn from a flour sack. And the repair ate half a day she had set aside for hanging east wall frames. Every warm day stole from her by breaking something the cold had been quietly holding together. By the 18th, she had 1 full wall enclosed 20 feet of south-facing glass, in 12 braced and puttied frames standing its 3 feet off the logs, with the packed earth between. She moved 6 hens inside during the daylight as a test. They scratched in the straw, they muttered to one another, they pressed their bodies to the cabin wall, where the low sun had warmed the logs through, and within the hour, the air inside the glass space stood warmer than the air inside the cabin itself. Edith laid her bare hand against the south wall from within and felt it. Warm. Not the warmth of summer, not the warmth of a banked fire, but warm where for weeks there had been only the long, cold breathing of a wall that was no barrier at all. For the first time since the barn stood empty, the cabin felt like something other than the thin partition between herself and her own dying. She did not let herself celebrate. She moved the hens back out into the cold and went on working, because the test had proven only one of the questions she needed answered. Soren watched her face when she felt the warm wall, then handed her the rest of the truth before she could grow soft on the part she had won. Now you know it works in sun. You do not know if it works in wind. You do not know if it works at night. You do not know if it holds at 30 below. She knew. Good. Brack will come back, and he will ask you those very things, and you will need answers that are not made out of hope. On the 22nd, a northwest gust hit at 2 in the morning, and she woke to a sound like a row of rifles firing in sequence glass, breaking in rapid order down the east wall. She lit the lamp and went out in her coat and bare feet over frozen ground to find 6 panes shattered along the east, where the wind had caught the joint of south meeting east, and spun itself into a vortex that flexed the frames sideways. His diagonal braces had held the frames in their places, but the panes themselves had popped from their rabbets and dropped into the dark. 6 gone in one night. She had 34 left, and not one she could afford to lose. He studied the damage in the morning without a word of comfort or complaint, reading the corner joint, the angle of the failed brace, the direction the putty had let go. Then he gave her the answer. The corner needs a wind post, a timber on the outside, not the inside, set right where the south wall turns to east. It breaks the gust before the gust can wrap the building. They set it that day, a cottonwood post 6 inches through, sunk 2 feet into the frozen ground, at the exact pivot of the two walls braced to both with scrap, until the corner could not flex if a team of horses leaned on it. This is what the snow sheds taught me. The wind does not push whatever a man thinks watching it. It wraps. It finds the corners and it pulls. You do not fight the push. You break the wrap. The goats made their own small war on the work. Twice in 3 days they chewed through the straw bedding in the glass space, dragging the strands out through the gap where the frames met the sill, and she built a low fence of scrap lumber to keep them clear of it. A fence that cost her the very nails she had been saving for the east frames. Every solution she found bought itself with something else she needed. On the 24th of November, Samuel cut his thumb to the bone, carrying a sash from the stack, the glass edge laying him open from nail to first knuckle deep enough that she saw white before the blood came up to hide it. She wrapped it in boiled cloth and sat him by the stove. He sat 20 minutes. Then he rose, came back out into the cold, and held a post steady with his good hand. He was 7. He did not know that what he did was remarkable. He knew only that Edith was working, and that not working felt worse to him than a cut thumb. Her own hands had passed beyond healing now. The knuckles of both stood split along the joints and lines that followed the bone-like seams worn into old harness leather. She wrapped them in grease and rag each night and peeled the rag away each morning to find it stuck fast to the wounds. Soren saw the state of them and said nothing because he had seen worse hands on railroad gangs, and because he understood that to speak of it would not lighten the work, only make the silence between them heavier to carry. But Soren Dahl's own body was failing in ways he took pains to hide. Twice in the last week of that month she caught him turning his back to the work to cough into a rag, and the second time she saw the rag before he could fold it from her sight. The stain was not the rust of a chest cold she had hoped to see. It was the bright, wet red of something living deeper in him, something with its own patient appetite. He caught her looking, put the rag away in his coat, and picked up the brace square as though the moment had not happened. The east vents. We cut them before the top rail freezes solid. She did not ask after the blood. He did not offer to name it. The work went on because stopping it was a thing neither of them could afford, and so the unspoken thing settled between them like a third presence patient and certain waiting its turn. On the 1st of December, the top vents were cut 3 hinged openings along the high side of the south wall, each a foot by 8 inches, worked by a peg and hole arrangement that let her open them from inside the glass space without climbing. He built the hinges from leather straps and whittled the pegs from a broken axe handle. The straw floor went down 4 inches of clean oat straw over the packed dirt to be changed out weekly against the damp. Along the cabin's south wall inside the glass space, she set a course of blackened creek stones she and the boy had hauled up from the dry bed, 14 of them in a row, each the size of a loaf of bread, dark with iron stain, and sitting in full sun from mid-morning until past the middle of the afternoon. The stones were his notion, married to her father's principle. Dark mass drinks, the heat then gives it back slow through the long hours after dark. How much heat, she asked him. Enough to notice, not enough to save you on its own. The stove still matters, the glass still matters, the hens still matter. One trick never wins the winter. All of them together working at once might. Help arrived from a direction she had not looked. On the 4th of December, Caleb Brunhanna's eldest drove up in his mother's wagon with 2 heavy pine storm shutters laid in the bed. They had been built by his late father for the dugout window and never once hung because that window faced north, and the shutters would have done no good there. He was 24, quiet-built, broad and plain as a fence post, plainly embarrassed to be standing in her yard at all. Ma says these were doing nothing in the loft. She used them as night covers over the weakest east panes, the ones patched with oiled cloth where the broken glass had been leaning them against the frames each dusk to break the wind while trapping what warmth the space still held, lifting them away each dawn to let the low sun back in. It was not elegant, it would not last, but it was one more layer between the cabin and the cold, and out here a life was measured in the layers a person could stack between herself and the open sky. Gideon Brackey returned on the 7th riding up with frost in his beard and his coat buttoned to the throat. He had not set eyes on the claim since October before any of this had existed, and he reined in at the fence line to sit a full minute staring at the structure standing 3 feet off the cabin's south wall, glinting in the hard winter sun like something halfway between a greenhouse and a fevered dream. He swung down and walked closer without a word. He paced the length of the south glass, paused at the windpost, where south turned east, went on along the east frames. He looked through the wavy panes at the straw floor, at the hens scratching within, at the row of black stones laid against the logs. "What is this?" "A glass walk," she told him. "I can see that much." "What does it do?" She opened the door to the space. "Put your hand inside." He hesitated, a man unaccustomed to being instructed by anyone, least of all her. Then he stepped in. The space ran narrow 3 feet from outer glass to cabin logs crowded with birds and straw, and the warm grain smell of healthy hens kept dry. The noon sun poured through the south panes onto the stones along the wall. The air inside stood plainly warmer than the air at his back. He stood there 10 minutes silent, the first 5 of them. Then he laid his bare palm flat against the cabin's south wall and felt the warmth bleeding through the logs from the heated pocket of air. "How warm does it run?" On a clear day at 8 degrees outside, she told him the glass walk reaches the mid-50s by noon, and the cabin holds in the low 40s with the stove damped down near to nothing. He withdrew his hand. He looked at the vents, at the diagonals, at the unbroken beads of putty. "You are building the winter out of your own house." But the certainty had drained from his voice, and that was the whole of it. He was no longer telling her she was wrong. He was telling himself that she might not be, and the distance between those two things was the distance between everything he had learned in 40 years and everything she had wagered in 2 months. He did not praise her. He put on his hat. He rode back toward Redfield. But he did not laugh, and on the Dakota prairie, a man who has stopped laughing has already begun in some hidden chamber of himself to believe. By the 12th of December, the shell was complete, 20 feet along the south, 14 along the east, 3 feet of held air, 34 panes and 10 frames braced with his diagonals, sealed with warmed linseed, shimmied with leather, backed on the weak east side with oiled cloth and Caleb Brune's pine shutters. The floor lay packed and strawed. The 14 stones sat in their row. 23 hens moved through the space in daylight, their bodies adding a low, constant warmth that smelled of feathers and grain. From the road it looked ridiculous, still the mismatched panes shimmering green and bubbled 2 of them, showing the reverse station letters faded to ghost marks, the wind setting the whole rig to its bottle crate rattle whenever it swung from the west. But she had 3 thermometers now. One hung outside under the north eave, one inside the glass walk at chest height, one on the cabin table by the stove. On the 13th, with the outside glass reading 8 above, and the sky swept clear, the glass walk climbed to 56 by noon, while the cabin rose from 26 to 41, on a stove damped to a near sleep, the firewood lasting 3 times what Brack's arithmetic had sworn it could. The trap was no greenhouse, for nothing in it burned. It was only a pocket of still air that caught the sun, held it against the logs, let the wood drink it, the way a stone by a hearth drinks the fire's heat long after the flame has died. The idea was simple. The execution was ugly. The result was a thing his numbers could no longer wave away. But the warmth carried its own new enemy in its arms. On the 15th, she found frost beating on the cabin logs, inside the glass space, not outside where frost belonged, but inside where the warm, damp breath of the hens met the cold face of the wood. The glaze was thin, near invisible. Soren saw it, and his face changed. "Open the vents." It was 14 degrees outside. She would lose the heat she had fought for. "You will lose the wall." He made her open the high vents 10 minutes. Warm air rushed up and out. Cold air dropped in its place. The frost on the logs began to dry. Warm rot kills a wall slower than frost kills a child. But it still kills. You vent every morning and every afternoon, 10 minutes each, even when it costs you and even when it hurts. He was right, and she knew it, and the knowing rewrote what the glass walk was. The innovation was not magic. It was a trade. Warmth bought with vigilance, comfort paid for in discipline, every benefit chained to a condition that demanded daily attention from a woman already doing the work of 3. The doubters only sharpened their knives. Hannah came by and pronounced the warmth a trick of the mild weather, no real storm having yet been thrown at it. Wait for a whiteout. Bracky, who had stopped laughing but had not begun to believe, said the first true wind would peel the roof off the glass walk and leave her worse than before, nail holes punched in the logs, Shattered glass mixed through the straw hens, scattered dead across the prairie. Pruitt did not come himself but sent word through a customer that he would pay $2 for the glass after it broke. He said after not if and the choice of the word traveled the whole district inside a day. Edith began recording the temperatures each evening in pencil on the back of the receipt Orrin Voss had written her, the date the outside reading the glass walked the cabin. She did it because Soren told her to. Numbers are the only argument that outlives an opinion. When they come to tell you it does not work, you put the numbers in front of them and you let the numbers do the talking. The shell held through December's ordinary cold. The morning settled into a rhythm she could lean on vent at first light, the slow gathering of noon warmth, the afternoon feeding the long descent into evening cold. She burned an armload every 6 hours, where Bracky's math had demanded one, every 4. The stove running low, the cabin holding warm, the firewood pile sinking by inches instead of by feet. The hens kept laying 3 eggs a day, 4 on a good one. Not the dozen of summer, but a steady current, because the birds were dry and fed and sheltered from the wind that would have stopped them cold in an open coop. The eggs were money. She traded them at Garrett for oats at Redfield for salt, with a neighbor for a sack of meal. The glass walk was not only keeping her warm, it was keeping her solvent one small clutch of eggs at a time. But every morning she looked north, and every morning she understood that the real test had not yet shown its face. December had been cold. December had not been deadly. The kind of cold that emptied whole settlements, that killed cattle on their feet and men within sight of their own doors, had not yet come down off the high plains. When it came, it would not announce itself. It would come fast out of a clear morning, and everything she and the dying carpenter had braced and puttied and vented into place would either hold against it or it would not, and the difference would be counted in living bodies. January of 1888 began wrong, which on the prairie was the only warning a person ever got. The 12th dawned warm, not mild, but warm, the mercury climbing toward 40 by mid-morning, the crusted snow softening and sliding off the glass walk roof in thin running streams. The hens came out of the straw to stand blinking in a sun that felt like a lie told by April. Edith opened every vent she had. The glass walk hit 80 before noon, so warm the birds stood panting with their wings held out from their bodies, the straw giving off the fermented smell of summer hay. It was the kind of day that made a careful person careless. Samuel asked if he might walk down to the Brunn dugout, where Caleb had promised to let him help haul water the boy, having been shut indoors for the better part of a month. She said yes. She watched him cross the softening snow to the south, his coat hanging open, his cracked slate tucked beneath one arm, because he never went anywhere without it. And he turned once at the low rise between the properties to lift a hand to her before he dropped from sight. Soren came late that morning, walking slower than she had ever seen him move the cough, working up from somewhere below his ribs in a deep, wet labor that bent him at the waist. He lowered himself onto the bench inside the glass walk and watched the thermometer climb and said nothing for a long while. Then he gave her the warning she would replay for the rest of her life. Close everything if the wind shifts around to south by east. Why, she asked him. Warm air out of the south in January is a lid set over a pot. When the lid lifts, the cold falls in all at once, and it falls fast. She looked at the sky. It had gone hazy. The sun wore a pale ring, the kind her father had called a weather eye. The air smelled wet and heavy, like a blanket left too long beside a fire. How fast, she asked. I have watched it run from 40 above to 10 below inside 4 hours. On the rails, we lost a man in Minnesota who walked a quarter mile from the depot without his coat. It was 50 degrees when he set out. It was 8 below when they found what was left of him. She closed the vents. She latched the door of the glass walk. She fed the stove 2 of the large pieces she had been rationing, then filled the water pails from the well, while the pump still drew her eyes going again to the south rise, where the boy had gone over. The first sign came at 1 in the afternoon, and it was not snow. It was silence. The wind that had blown soft out of the south all morning simply stopped. The thin whistle of the eastbound freight that carried up from Garrett on still days, more a vibration in the chest than a sound in the ear, cut off in the middle of its note. The hens fell quiet. Even the goats, who were never quiet, stood motionless in their shed, with their ears swung forward, listening to a thing she could not yet hear. Then the sky changed, not to the gray of cloud, but to the gray of struck iron, a color with weight in it, and no light behind it at all, and the mercury began to drop. She felt it first in her face, a tightening of the skin as though the air itself were pressing inward against her. She went to the north thermometer. 38. 5 minutes brought it to 31. 5 more carried it to 24. 7 degrees gone in 10 minutes, falling like a stone down a well. The snow came then, but it was not falling snow. It came sideways, driven flat out of the northwest by a wind that arrived with the weight of something thrown so hard she could not make out the goat shed. From the cabin door, a stretch of 40 feet swallowed whole. The world simply ceased. One moment she could pick out the fence line, the road, the faint smudge of Hannah's chimney smoke to the south. The next there was nothing but moving white and a roar like a freight that came on without end and never once passed. Samuel was at the Bruin dugout. The thought struck her like a fist to the breastbone. 3 miles south, across open ground in a whiteout, a boy of 7 who weighed 60 pounds soaking wet and had never in his short sheltered life seen weather that could kill a grown man inside a quarter hour. Every instinct she owned told her to stay inside the one warm structure standing between Redfield and the end of the earth. The glass walk was holding. The cabin was warm. The hens lived. If she walked out into that and died in it, the boy would be made an orphan. A second time the claim would fall to Pruitt. Every nail she had driven and every pain she had bled for would amount to nothing in the spring. But Samuel was out there in the white, and the arithmetic of the heart does not balance the way the arithmetic of firewood does. She took the rope down from its peg. 50 feet of hemp she used to tether the goats, knotted one end to the porch post, tied the other about her own waist, and walked into the roar. Visibility had closed to less than 10 feet. The wind caught her broadside the moment she cleared the porch, staggering her sideways until she fetched up hard against the goat shed wall with the breath knocked out of her. Inside, the two animals had pressed themselves into a single shivering mass. Their eyes rolled wide, their breath torn away before it could cloud. She tied a second length from the shed to the fence post at the south edge of her ground, giving herself 120 feet of guideline running from cabin to the rim of her own land. Past that lay nothing but open prairie and 3 miles of white air standing between her and the Brun dugout. She nearly turned back. The cold had stopped being a temperature and become a force, a thing with hands that pushed at her chest while it pulled the warmth out through every seam in her clothing. Her face burned. Her fingers, double mittened, had already gone numb at the tips. Then a shape came out of the white, and it was not Samuel. It was Hannah's youngest, a boy of 5 running without a coat, his arms pumping, his mouth wide open around a scream. The wind swallowed whole before it reached her. He hit the fence line at a stumble and grabbed it with both small fists and held. She caught him up, wrapped her coat around the trembling body, and carried him into the glass walk to set him in the straw beside the warm stones. He shook so violently his teeth made a sound like a finger tapping a nail, and she could not understand the words coming out of him until slowly she could. Mama fell down. Sam fell down. They are on the ground. She shut the glass walk door against the storm. Soren had not moved from the bench. His face had gone the gray of the sky. His coat pulled tight, his hands folded in his lap as though he were saving every last ember of himself. He looked at her, then handed her the last useful thing he had left to give. Take the rope, all of it, not the lengths together. She tied 3 lengths into one, near 200 feet long enough to reach past her own fence and out into the blind ground between her property and Hannah's. She made one end fast to the porch post and walked into the wind, paying the line out hand over hand behind her, counting her steps, because counting was the only way left to know how far she had gone, when the world had no near and no far, no up and no down, only the roar and the white. 100 steps, 200. The rope drew taut. She had reached the end of it, and she stood there at the limit of 200 feet of hemp and screamed the boy's name into the storm. The wind took the sound and shredded it to nothing. She screamed again. A hand closed around her ankle. Hannah Bruin lay on the ground crawling. Her shawl had frozen into a stiff hood about her head, her face the dead gray color of a tallow candle. Behind her, one hand fisted in the widow's skirt, came Samuel. His right mitten was gone. His bare hand had gone white past the knuckles. Edith hauled them both up out of the snow, put the boy between her own body and Hannah's, and gave the only order that mattered. Hold the rope. Do not let go of it. Walk. They walked, or they stumbled, or they crawled, the distinction beneath caring. The rope was everything. Hand over frozen hand, step over blind step. They followed the line back through air that had unmade the prairie until the fence came under their hands, then the shed, then the porch. She pulled them through the glass walk door and shut it, and the storm dropped from a roar to a moan, and the held warmth struck their faces like a wall raised against the dark. The glass walk was holding, though not whole. 6 panes on the east had cracked through the wind, whistling its way in along the fractures in thin threads. The straw nearest that wall lay dusted with fine snow sifted through the breaks. But the south wall stood intact, the pocket of air behind it still warm, the hens still alive in their pressed mass against the logs, the thermometer reading 26. She brought Samuel to the stones first, not the cabin, but the stones, the blackened creek rock that had drunk the sun through the warm morning hours and still held the heat of it. She pressed his frozen hand flat to the warmest of them and held it there. The stone was not hot. It carried only the warmth of skin on a temperate day, blood warm and no more. But against a hand that had been freezing toward ruined blood, warm was a kind of mercy. She wrapped the fingers in dry straw, then in a wool scarf, then in her own 2 hands, and she sat down on the floor of the glass walk with a half-dead boy in her lap and a near-frozen woman at her side while the storm labored to take apart everything she had raised. Hannah's youngest lay against the cabin wall with a hen settled warm in his lap. His shaking stopped his eyes shut. Soren rose to check the braces. He went out into the storming length of the glass walk with the panes booming under each gust and inspected every frame, every diagonal, every joint where sill met post, then came back and gave his verdict without softening it. The east will lose more glass before this is done. The south will hold. How long, she asked him. As long as it needs to. The night was the worst of it. The outside mercury fell past 20 below, past 25, and sometime after midnight, she carried the lamp to the north thermometer and read 30 below and still sinking. The wind never paused, never gathered itself, only drove on in waves that packed the snow against the glass, in sliding drifts that climbed the sill. Inside the glass walk, the air held at 19, cold past comfort, but 49 degrees warmer than the killing air on the far side of the panes. And 49 degrees was the whole width of the gap between a body that lived and a body that did not. Inside the cabin, with the stove fed steady now and the rationing set aside, the air held at 35, cold enough to fog the breath, cold enough to skin the wash basin with ice by dawn, warm enough that the boys' wrapped fingers returning slowly, and through real pain to their color, would not be lost to him. The north side of this cabin told the rest of the night's story in a language no man could argue with. The lean-to storage shed on the north wall, with no glass to shield it, no buffer of held air exposed to the full fist of the northwest wind, stood at 10 below inside its own walls. A bucket of water she had set there in the morning had frozen solid by midnight, frozen so hard the wooden staves cracked and the ice rose in a dome over the rim. Inside the glass walk, a bucket of the same make, filled from the same well, set on the straw near the cabin logs, wore nothing but a skim of ice across its top. She broke that skim with one knuckle, and the water beneath ran liquid against her skin. 2 buckets, the same water the same night, one split to its staves with ice, one barely touched. 20 feet of ground stood between them, 20 feet, and a wall of salvaged depot glass, a pocket of still air, the banked warmth of 23 crowded birds, 14 stones that had spent one clear morning drinking the sun. The 45-degree difference was not a figure she calculated in the dark of that night. It was a number she would learn later, comparing the readings by daylight. But the proof was already in her hands, physical and immediate, and past all denial. The north shed was a coffin, in fact. The glass walk was shelter, in fact. The only difference between them was the thing Amos Pruitt had named a palace for chickens. Across the wider prairie, the storm was doing its old work. Bracca's hired man, trying to reach an exposed claim shanty, a half-mile off, made 200 yards before the wind put him down, then crawled the rest on hands and knees to arrive with frostbite, gnawing both ears and 3 fingers of his left hand that would blacken by morning. A neighbor's cow froze standing upright in a board shed, whose walls let the wind through like a sieve found at first light on its feet, with ice packed in its nostrils and its eyes open on nothing. Even Pruitt was not spared the lesson. His own coal had failed him, his delivery stranded somewhere on the rails, his preparation collapsing in precisely the manner he had so confidently predicted hers would. so that the man who had sold her short spent that night feeding broken crates into his storeroom stove. Morning broke blue and dead still. The wind quit as suddenly as it had risen, leaving a silence so total she could hear the blood moving in her own ears. She opened the glass walk door and stepped out, and the cold took her like a slap still well below zero. But the air hung calm under a sky gone the hard, bright blue that follows a killing storm, the kind of blue that aches to look upon. The glass walk stood. Payne's cracked straw snowed over the east corner, patched with cloth, and Caleb's pine but standing. The hens lived. Samuel lived, his fingers swollen and angry red, but moving at his command. Hannah lived, her face blistered by the cold, her voice scraped to a rasp, her eyes holding something that had not been in them the day before. The two buckets sat where she had left them, the north one a column of clouded ice, the glass walk one liquid water with a broken disk of skim ice floating on its surface. That was the argument. Not words, not the sums Brackey had laid down, not Pruitt's clever cruelty. Two buckets 20 feet apart, telling two opposite stories about what it cost to outlast a night at 30 below. The blizzard had answered a question. It had not yet settled the argument because the men who had laughed needed to come and put their own hands to the proof. Brackey came first, riding up before noon the day after frost still in his beard. His horse blowing clouds, the cold turned to crystal before they fell. He had ridden out expecting to find shattered glass and a humbled woman. He had even rehearsed the words something practical, something without cruelty in it, something that would honor a brave attempt without endorsing a foolish one because he had buried enough of the stubborn to have the tone by heart. He reined in at the fence and looked at the glass walk cracked and patched and leaning where the east corner had taken the worst, but holding the line, the south panes throwing the morning sun into the space behind them and through the wavy glass. The hens moving in the straw, alive, scratching, making the small, contented sounds that living birds make when they are fed and warm and have not frozen in their own feathers overnight. He dismounted. He walked to the door and stepped through without knocking because it was not a house. The warmth that met him was not the blast of a heated parlor, but a quiet difference, the simple physical fact that the air burning his lungs outside did not burn them in here. The straw was damp but not frozen. The stones along the wall were cool to the touch, yet not cold. The hens ignored him. One pecked at his boot. He pulled off a glove and laid his bare hand flat to the cabin's south wall, and the logs were warm in a way that no wall standing through a night of 30 below had any right to be. The heat lodged deep in the wood itself, slow and held drawn out of the sun-warmed air across the daylight hours, and kept there by the mass of the timber and the stillness of the trapped air around it. He stood with his palm pressed to the wood a long time. When he spoke, the iron had gone out of his voice, leaving something stripped bare. "I told you the winter would come through it. I was wrong. You made it stop outside the wall." He did not apologize. He did not say he should have lent a hand sooner. He was not that kind of man, and she did not need him to be. What he did instead was ask a question, and the question was the whole of his surrender. Could a smaller one of these wrap the south wall of a sod kitchen? It was not idle. He had a sod kitchen behind his own cabin, low and thick-walled and bitter cold, where his wife baked. 40 years he had believed heat came only from fuel a man burned, and here he stood in a glass walk full of hens asking whether sunlight might keep his bread from freezing. Yes, she told him. If the wall faced south and he left the 3 feet of air, and he fenced the hens off the logs, and he vented it 10 minutes morning and afternoon without fail. He nodded, drew the glove back on, and rode away without thanks, because the question had been the thanks, and they both knew it. The method began to travel then, the way useful knowledge always traveled out there, hand to hand. Hannah came back, but her conversion had happened already on the floor of the glass walk, with a frozen shawl about her head, and Edith's rope clutched in her fists. What she brought now was not belief, but specification. A knotted string marked at 3-foot intervals, a stub of charcoal, a list of questions scratched on the back of a feed sack. Where do the vents go? How far apart? How steep must the roof run for the snow to shed? How many stones to the foot of wall? Edith answered. Each one walked her through the space, pointed to every failure as readily as every success. Every cracked pane, every cloth-patched gap, every joint that had been tested in the storm and held or let go and been rebuilt. She did not sell it as a perfect thing. She offered it as a set of principles a person could bend to her own ground, And Hannah, who distrusted perfection on principle, trusted the imperfection that came with honest measurements. Pruitt watched the method spread from behind his counter, and he did what he had always done, which was hunt for the angle that turned another's gain into his own. His first stroke was an accusation. The glass belonged to the railroad taking. It was theft, and theft voided a homestead claim. He said it loudly before witnesses, and the charge crawled the district inside 3 days until it reached her ears. She walked to Garrett. She found Orrin Voss on his platform, sweeping at nothing the way he always did, and asked him for a copy of the receipt. He did not hesitate. He opened the depot ledger, found the entry, $3 and 2 dozen eggs, dated October of 1887, for salvage sash and frames from the decommissioned Garrett waiting room, and wrote her a duplicate in his careful clerk's hand signed. It pressed the depot seal into it. If Pruitt cares to argue with a railroad receipt, he is welcome to take the matter up with the division office. Pruitt did not take it up with the division office. His second stroke was subtler. The warmth, he told people, came from animal filth, not sunlight. The hens making the heat, while the glass did nothing, so that the woman had merely built an expensive chicken coop and confused the reek of manure with the glow of cleverness. Soren answered that one. He was on the bench inside the glass walk when word of it reached the claim, carried by a neighbor who repeated it with the embarrassment of a man who does not credit what he is obliged to report. The carpenter pushed himself to his feet, coughed once that deep, wet rattle that had become the metronome of his days, and gave his reply. "Bring Pruitt out here. Stand him in this glass walk at noon. Then stand him in the north shed. If he cannot feel the difference, his trouble is not with the building. His trouble is with his own hands." Pruitt did not come. He did not need to. The refusal was itself the answer, telling the whole district which man understood the truth and which feared it. Through the deep of that winter, Soren and Edith refined the work, not chasing revelations, but discharging obligations, making a crude system less crude, one adjustment at a time. They hung a removable canvas curtain inside the glass, drawn across at sundown, to slow the heat bleeding back out through the panes, good for 2 or 3 degrees on a clear night. They painted 2 more pails with stove blacking, filled them with water, set them where the sun struck them full, and let them drink the heat through the day to release it slow through the dark. They built a low barrier of lath to keep the hens from pressing their damp against the logs, the moisture being the one enemy that never slept. Soren did not treat these as discoveries. He treated them as the duty a thing owes its own future. The design works. Now it has to work better and longer, and in the hands of people less careful than you. He took to calling her Builder, not Mrs. Halverson, not Edith, but Builder, the word carrying real weight from a man who had spent his life raising things that lives leaned on. It was not sentiment. It was a classification, a placing of her among those who grasped that making a thing right was a different act from merely making it, and that the difference was worth more than the thing. He worsened as the season turned. The cough that had begun as a rasp settled into something that folded him double and left him breathless minutes at a stretch. He hid it from the boy. He could not hide it from her. The rags came away red more often than not, and he moved slower by the day, resting between tasks he had once done without a pause. His last teaching came on a warm afternoon in late March, the sun strong enough to drive the glass walk to 70 by noon, 2 hens panning the straw souring. She wanted to leave the vents shut, for neighbors were coming to see the thing in operation, and she wanted the heat to be impressive. He made her open them, then went further and lifted 2 panes clean out, leaning them against the logs to let the spring air move through in slow currents, cooling the straw, drying the wood, calming the birds. The visitors will carry off the wrong lesson if you show them a system that cooks its own walls. When they arrived to a glass walk, merely warm rather than dramatic, he showed them the vent pegs marked sun and damp and storm, and told them the pegs mattered more than the glass. A thing that holds heat must also know how to let it go. Build this and forget to vent it, and you will rot every log you meant to save. The vents are not a weakness in the design. The vents are the design. He died in April in the rented room above the Redfield livery alone, which was how he had lived, but not how he had worked. He left her 3 things: his brace square, his putty knife, and a railroad notebook filled with sketches of bridges and snow sheds and depot vestibules, and on the last 3 pages, the glass walk drawn from above, from the side, from within, looking out, measured in his careful hand. She did not weep when the word reached her. She walked to the livery, gathered his things, carried them home, set the brace square on the shelf above the table, the putty knife in the toolbox, the notebook beneath her pillow. She wept that night in the dark, the boy asleep in the loft, the hen settling in the glass walk, the wind pressing soft against the panes. She wept because the cabin was warm, and the man who had helped her make it warm lay cold in Redfield ground, and there was nothing she could build to mend that. The sun came through the glass the next morning, the way it always had. The stones warmed, the birds murmured, and she went to work because work was the only language she owned for grief, and because he would have been angry to find her doing anything else. The second winter's crisis arrived in October of 1889, an ice storm coming early weeks before Hannah's new glass porch was fully closed in. Its east side stood open. The vents were uncut. The frames had been hung without the diagonal because Caleb meant to add it the following week. The storm came in the night, dropped the air to 9 degrees, set the unbraced east frames flexing, sent condensation running down the inner wall of the dugout entry in streams that pooled on the dirt floor and turned to ice. Caleb panicked, his every instinct that of a builder who has never watched moisture eat a wall, wanting to stuff rags in every gap board up the open side, seal the whole thing tight against the cold. Edith arrived before noon. She read the water on the wall, the ice on the floor, the desperation on the face of a young man who had promised his mother a thing he now believed he could not deliver. Open the top. There are no top vents, he told her. They are not cut. Then prop the 2 highest frames off the sill 2 inches. Use a stick. That lets the cold in. The cold is already in. The water is worse. She showed him propping the frames to a gap no wider than 2 fingers, cold air, entering high, warm, wet air, bleeding out. And inside an hour, the condensation had stopped growing and begun to dry the porch, falling from 38 to 31 colder, but survivable, the wall that 3 days of running water would have ruined, beginning to save itself. She stayed the night. Hannah's youngest, the same small boy who had run coatless through the blizzard 9 months before, had taken croup, his breathing gone harsh and wet until each pull sounded like a saw dragged through green wood. She moved him into the glass porch, warmer than the dugout. Even with the frames propped, hung a wet cloth near the vented gap where the entering cold met the leaving warmth, and the moisture off the cloth softened the air. He fought to breathe. By morning, the croup had eased. By the next day, the boy was eating. It was not the glass that saved him. It was the principle behind the glass, the understanding that trapped air must be managed, that warmth and damp had to be balanced against each other, that sealing everything tight was never safety, but only a different shape of danger. She had taken a thing Soren taught her and applied it without him in a structure she had not built against a trouble she had not foreseen, and it had held. That was the moment the innovation left her own claim and became a method, not because she had taught it, for she had been teaching it for months, but because she had adapted it. Pruitt saw the method spreading, and he found his way to profit from the very thing he had mocked. In November of 1889, he began importing cheap, thin panes from a wholesaler down the line, bundling them with scrap lumber and a sheet of printed instructions he had written or hired written, selling the lot as storm glass kits at $3.50. The kits held no diagonal braces. The lumber was green and warped. The instructions said nothing of warming the putty, nothing of vent spacing, nothing of the 3 feet of held air. They told the buyer to nail the glass flush against the logs. He sold 11 kits inside 3 weeks. The first failure came on a Thursday in early December, 8 miles west. A family named Solheim who had nailed a kit to their south wall by his instructions. Flush, no gap, no vents. Green frames spiked rigid to green logs. When the air dropped to 14 with a northwest wind behind it, the lumber twisted, the frames flexed, and 7 of the 9 panes cracked and dropped, shattering on the frozen ground before the cabin, the glass cutting the bare foot of one of their children. Pruitt blamed her design. The concept was rotten, he said. Glass had no business in a prairie winter. Anyone building such a thing gambled with his family's lives. The phrase he settled on, repeated at his stove to the same men in the same chairs, was that Halverson glass does not hold. She did not go to his store. She went to the Solheim cabin, looked at the nail holes punched in their logs, the broken glass on the ground, the kit lumber already twisted a 1/4 inch in the fortnight since it was hung. She picked up a length of it and held it beside one of Soren's diagonal braces, which she had carried in her coat pocket, and showed them the difference the seasoned cottonwood cut at its angle and toenailed with 2 against the green pine-cut square, and spiked with 4 nails driven so hard they had split the grain. This is not my design. Mine has bracing. Mine has an air gap. Mine has vents. This has none of those things. This is lumber nailed to a wall with glass set in front of it, and it was never going to hold. She said it quietly. She had no need to raise her voice. The Solheims could feel the difference between the 2 pieces of wood in their own hands. Word traveled the way it always did. And inside a week, 3 more families who had bought the kits came to her claim to compare, and she showed them everything in the glass walk itself, where the evidence was the temperature of the air against their skin. Bracky saw the cut child on his road rounds and came to her claim the same afternoon. Pruitt sold them lumber and called it a plan. Yes, she told him, and the kits would kill someone outright when the glass dropped inward in a storm, a child sleeping near the wall laid open in the dark. He rode to Redfield that afternoon. What passed between the 2 men she never heard firsthand, but Pruitt stopped selling the kits. He did not apologize. He did not admit the fault. He merely cleared the bundled lumber and glass from his counter and set up a sign reading, "Storm Glass, Inquire," within, which meant he would sell the glass but not the plan, which meant that anyone wanting the method would have to come to her for it. It was no victory. It was a truce enforced by shame and the threat of a dead child. The man contained rather than changed, and she added him to the list of things she watched through the winter, alongside the vents and the putty and the straw. The thing that finally broke Pruitt's resistance came not from her but from his own coal. In late December, the delivery he depended on for his store failed the supply, stranded by ice, then rerouted, then stranded again. The delay stretching from 3 days to 12, and on the 4th night without coal, the air in Redfield fell to 22 below, and his storeroom froze. 18 jars of preserved fruit burst as the liquid in them turned to ice. Lamp oil cracked its tins and bled across the floorboards into a stain that would breathe kerosene for years. A barrel of molasses froze to a block so hard that when it thawed in spring, the staves had split and the syrup had run out across a shelf of dry goods worth more than her whole claim. He came to her at dusk on a January evening, alone on foot, without the good wool coat he wore in the store, to remind his customers he was a man of substance, wearing, instead, a canvas jacket and a hat pulled low, moving with the stiffness of a man who had been cold long enough that his body had forgotten how to move freely. He did not come to the door. He came to the glass walk, stood outside the panes, and looked in at the roosting hens, the dark heat-laden stones, the night curtain drawn the air within, shimmering faintly the way air shimmers over a summer road. He stood in the cold, looking at warmth he could not reach, and his face wore an expression she had never seen on it. Not humility, for Pruitt did humility no better than Bracky did. Softness, but calculation, the look of a man running figures he hated toward a total he could not dispute. She opened the door. He stood a moment in the silence, the hens shifting on their roost of pain, settling in a light gust. Then the question came out of him. What would it cost to put one of these over the store's south loading wall? She let it hang in the air the way he had once let the nail keg sit on the counter between them, let him feel the full weight of the asking. "I do not want your money." His face tightened, for money was the only tongue he spoke, and a refusal of it meant the bargain was being struck on ground he did not own. What did she want then? "Nails at cost, putty at cost, to any claimant who brings a signed plan from me for as long as you keep the store. That is not a price," he told her, "that is a subsidy. It is the builder's terms." He repeated the word with just enough skepticism to remind whoever might hear that titles could be doubted, and then another voice came out of the near-dark flat, and certain and past all patience, where Bracky sat his horse unseen against the last gray light. "You ask the builder. You take the builder's terms." Pruitt looked at the carpenter's old friend, at the woman at the structure doing the thing he had sworn was impossible, in the place he had called a coffin for the woman he had called a keeper of a hen palace. "I will need the plan by Saturday." He did not say he had been wrong. He agreed to the terms and walked back to Redfield in the dark. And that was the end of the hostile man, not a conversion, but a transaction which was truer to his nature than any change of heart could have been. He had not become a believer. He had become a customer, and out here where survival ran on trade, a customer who sold materials at cost was worth more than a convert who offered nothing but admiration. Caleb Brune had been present through all of it, the building, the teaching, the storm, the slow turning of a whole community from mockery to measurement, present the way a fence post is present, upright and load-bearing, and so steadily there that a person stops noticing it until she leans her weight on it and finds it solid. He had hauled sash when her hand sled broke. He had dug post holes in frozen ground when her hands were too split to grip the shovel. The courting, if it could be called that, happened the way everything happened out there through labor. He did not bring her flowers. He brought lumber. He did not write letters. He reset the east corner post after a spring storm loosened its footing. He walked Samuel the 4 miles to the Garrett school through the storms of that winter and the 4 miles home again, without being asked and without mentioning it, unless she mentioned it first. She noticed. She was not unaware, only occupied. And there is a difference between a woman who does not see a man and a woman who sees him clearly and is waiting to learn whether what she sees will hold. She had married once on the strength of words, and the words had ridden off on a stolen horse, and she would not do it again on anything less than evidence. The evidence accumulated. He fixed the glass walk door when its leather hinge tore. He arrived the morning after a bad blow and checked every pane before she woke, and when she came out to find him on a ladder with the putty knife in hand, he offered only this. The northeast corner had a whistle in it. I stopped it. The thing she came to trust about Caleb was that he never once asked her to be grateful. A man who had wanted thanks would have mentioned the 4-mile walks to the school, would have let the cold he carried home in his bones become a small bill laid quietly on her table. He did not. He let the work speak, and then he let it go. And that silence after the labor was the first thing about a man she had ever found she could lean her whole weight against. Walter had been all words and no work. Here was the reverse of him, and the reverse turned out to be the thing that held. She caught herself one evening watching his hands at the putty steady where hers had once bled, and she understood with a small private shock that she had stopped bracing against the disappointment she had always assumed was coming. The proposal when it came in the spring of 1890 was no proposal in the way the word is usually meant. They were sitting in the glass walk on a warm April evening, watching the sun go down through the panes when he said it sideways. I am going to file on the quarter east of here. Good ground, she told him, fair ground, but it faces wrong. Wrong for what? For a cabin with its best wall toward your morning sun. He looked at the sunset through the wavy glass, a hen settling on his boot, and did not move it. Would you object if I built it that way? She laughed. It was the first time across the whole span from the day the barn stood empty to that evening that Edith Halverson had laughed without turning straight back to work, and the sound rang strange in the glass space bouncing off the panes and the stones, the hens lifting their heads startled because they had never once heard it. I would not object. They married in 1891 in Redfield Braca, standing witness, Hannah holding a fistful of prairie grass because there were no flowers in March. Samuel beside her in a coat that finally fit, holding the ring, a plain band Caleb had bought with money earned hauling freight for the same railroad whose abandoned glass had begun everything. The years after compress the way years do once the crisis passes and the daily work of living replaces the daily work of staying alive. Caleb raised his cabin on the next quarter, its south wall set within 5 degrees of true south. The glass buffer, the first thing he built before the floor, before the loft, before the door was hung. She braced it, the boy set the putty. They did not combine the claims. In 1892, she proved up her own quarter section at the Redfield Land Office, Brackey and Hannah, as witnesses, the clerk noting in the margin that the improvements included a glass-enclosed south and east buffer, the first such entry in the county's homestead records, though not the last. By then, 4 neighboring cabins carried glass buffers, 2 dugouts had sun porches, and the Redfield School had a glazed vestibule over its south door, the board having balked at the cost until Brackey stood the chairman outside it on a January morning and let 4 minutes of true cold persuade him. She never became famous. The method was never written up in any journal, never presented at a territorial fair, never adopted by the land office as recommended practice. It stayed local, practical, passed hand to hand, a set of principles carried in pencil on brown paper, and demonstrated in glass walks a person could step into and feel for herself. Samuel grew taller than the doorframe. By 1893, he was 13, lean and quiet, with hands that could test a pain by sound, A single rap of the knuckle telling him whether the glass sat seated or loose, a skill Soren had taught her and she had taught him. He did not remember a time before the glass walk. He became a carpenter, the trade Soren had practiced, and she had learned in between 1900 and 1920. He built buffers on 11 properties in the county, using the old brace square until the brass fittings wore smooth, then using it some more. He never called what he built a glass walk. He called it a buffer, the word hers, borrowed from Soren, borrowed in its turn from the railroad snow sheds that broke the wind before it could reach the rails. She lived out her life on the same quarter section she had been ordered to abandon. The hens changed, the glass changed, the boy grew tall enough to lift sashes she could no longer carry, but the winter habit held each autumn before the first hard freeze. She walked the glass walk and pressed each pane with 2 fingers, listening for the rattle, because a pane that rattled was a pane that would fail, and she fixed it that day, every day. It needed fixing for 30 years, because a dying carpenter had told her that a point which walks lets the pane walk, and a pane that walks falls. Edith Halverson died in the winter of 1917 of a pneumonia that settled in her lungs in December, and would not leave 62 years old in the same cabin where Brackey had laid his palm to the wall and pronounced the frost already inside the logs, in the same bed where she had counted her resources and found them impossibly short, and chosen to wager the lot on glass and sunlight and held air. The glass walk stood outside the south wall, rebuilt twice the panes. Not the originals, the frames, not the originals, the stones long since replaced, but the principal unchanged 3 feet of air. South-facing glass, dark mass against the wall. Vents high and low, the sun doing the work, the glass holding it, the builder watching. Amos Pruitt had called it a palace for chickens and a coffin for herself, and on the coldest remembered night, that palace held warmth enough to thaw a frozen mitten, and that coffin became the classroom where her neighbors learned to trap the sun. The last image is no figure and no principle, but a morning. The sky after the blizzard so blue it hurt the prairie still 30 below, and silent and behind the wavy mismatched bubble glass, salvaged from a dead depot, hands moving in gold light, scratching in warm straw. Alive because one woman had understood that winter sun is not warmth until it has trapped her hand flat against the cabin log. Warm and solid and holding while outside the cold reached all the way to the horizon and stopped 3 feet short of the wall.